The Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. This is the testimony given by John when the Judeans sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed, and he did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Then they said to him, "Who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the paths of the Lord.'" As the prophet Isaiah said. Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" He answered them, "I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know. The one who is coming after me, I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal." This took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So as a pastor who is grounded in and loves wrestling with Scripture, I hope that in my ministry I pass along some of my joy and my passion for the whole of the Scriptures. Not just the Gospels, not just Paul, although, as many of you know, I struggle with Paul sometimes, but the whole of Scriptures, including a love for the Hebrew Scriptures. After all, the Hebrew Scriptures are the Scriptures of Jesus. In these pages, we read the words he read, the words that he cherished, the words that he turned to again and again, words that clearly grounded him as he turned to them in his life and in his ministry. To the point that on the cross, in his own moment of need and pain, he turns to a psalm, Psalm 22. And these scriptures formed the early church, a church that did not yet have scriptures of their own. And I hope that they can form us too. My internship supervisor quite enjoyed preaching on the Hebrew scriptures. And if I remember correctly, he preaches on them as often as he preaches on the Gospels. Pastor Neil called the Christian scriptures a commentary on the Hebrew scriptures, meaning that what we find in the New Testament expands upon and builds upon that which we find in the Hebrew scriptures. But even further, it means that without the Hebrew scriptures, we cannot adequately grasp the Christian scriptures. And then it's hard to grasp this person, Jesus, this God incarnate, who we celebrate. The Christian scriptures are intrinsically linked with the Hebrew scriptures, and they cannot be separated. An imperfect image for this might be reading a sequel to a novel without reading the books that led up to it. In most cases, yes, you may be able to figure out the overarching plot, but you're also likely going to miss out on some key details. Or perhaps picking up a TV show midway through its airing, yeah, you might be able to figure out what's going on, but you miss everything that leads up to it. Without getting into the Hebrew scriptures, I fear that we miss some key details about God, and thus also about Jesus and everything that leads up to Jesus. After all, the God we meet in the Hebrew Scriptures is the same God who had this wild idea to become human and to dwell with us in Jesus. To quote Pastor Grant Vanderford from a Facebook conversation this week, the same word that was spoken at creation and exploded out of nothing into everything, the same word the prophets announced, demanding justice, freedom, and mercy for the oppressed, the same word we believe becomes incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, the Messiah. I find myself coming back to these pages again and again, thanks to a love instilled in me by the beloved Dr. Frank Aiken. These texts bring me hope. They bring wonder at the God who was, who is, and who is to come. The God made known in the manger. It brings with it wrestling like Jacob at the Jabbok. And they help me imagine what in the world God is doing in this person called Jesus, God with us, Emmanuel. Okay, so coming as no shock to you, after this mini sermon on why I love the Hebrew Scriptures, my sermon turns again this morning to Isaiah. A quick contextual note. The passage for this morning comes in the later chapters of the book of Isaiah. These chapters are written after the Israelites come home from about 50 years of exile. They come home and, well, homecoming was a bit, well, bittersweet. Yes, they're home, but home doesn't look or feel like home anymore. There are loved ones that never made it home, either dying in battle or dying in exile. They came home not to beautiful buildings, but to rubble. They came home to people living in their houses. What they had was no longer. They came home to ruins, devastations, and ruined cities, as the text says this morning. In other words, they came home to a bit of a train wreck. And from this point is where we find the words of the prophet this morning. This text is honest. Coming home didn't make things better all at once. The world of the exile wasn't the world that God had envisioned for them. But you know what? This isn't either. I can only imagine how easily coming home to a train wreck could lead to despair. God did this wonderful thing, brought liberty to the captives and set the prisoners free, and yet they came home to rubble. And through the prophet this morning, we get promise and we get hope. And there are lots of things in this passage that a preacher can point to. God's everlasting covenant, God's promise to make whole and vibrant things in place of the gray, gloomy things, garland instead of ashes, mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. God's promise to rebuild. Any one of those could be a sermon all on its own. It is such a rich text. And admittedly, in part, I'm putting it here for Advent 3 in 2023 when we get this text again. But it's also a nod to those wonderful images in the text that I don't want you to miss. For today, however, I'm going to turn to the last image in this passage. The prophet writes, "For as the earth brings forth its shoots, as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all the nations." In the midst of hopelessness, Isaiah points to the small for a sign of hope. In the midst of chaos, Isaiah points to creation and creation's rhythms for a sign of restoration. In the midst of what looks like death, Isaiah turns to a garden as a sign of God's never relenting life springing forth. Recently, on the recommendation of my father, I watched David Attenborough's documentary on Netflix, A Life in Our Planet. Even if you don't know him by name, you probably know him by voice. He has done many, many nature documentaries over the last nearly 70 years. It is a fantastic documentary. This time, I am highly recommending that y'all watch this. He calls this his witness statement. In it, as a 94-year-old, Attenborough reflects on his 70-year career and the changes that he has witnessed in nature in his lifetime, and how we as a humanity have contributed to that change. He calls it a witness statement. I would call it his love letter. A love letter to a planet that he has loved, and a love letter to humanity to try to call the fellow human into love for the planet. And he offers suggestions so that these changes that he has witnessed doesn't have to be. At times he points a bleak, but incredibly honest. Sometimes honesty is bleak picture of where we are headed as a humanity in relationship with this earth. But at the end, he turns and he gives this incredible picture of hope. He offers a vision of what can be if we live with nature and in harmony with nature, working with nature instead of against nature. He says quite clearly that nature can and will come back to life. At the closing, he says this: in the end, after a lifetime's exploration of the living world, I am certain about one thing. This is not about saving our planet. It is about saving ourselves. The truth is, with or without us, the world will rebuild. In the 30 years since Chernobyl, nature has reclaimed the space. Today, the forest has taken over the city. It is a sanctuary for wild animals that are rare elsewhere. And powerful evidence that however grave our mistakes, nature will overcome them. The living world will endure. Attenborough points out that even despite nuclear disaster, nature finds a way to life again and again and again. And this points to God's commitment to life, and God finds this way to bring about life again and again and again, even when it looks like life cannot be found. So amid the rubble, Isaiah says, look to the shoots of the earth. Despite all of the things and many of those things we do to ourselves, despite the things that try to stifle life, shoots still find a way to spring up. I think about roots and weeds that find their way through our concrete. A few years ago in some town in Ohio, a weed found its way through the cracks of a sidewalk on a city corner about this time of year. Instead of pulling the weed or spraying it with weed killer, the residents of the town decorated this weed. That still small weed became a symbol of hope that winter. The so-called Christmas weed became a reminder of God's stubborn commitment to life. It can be difficult to find hope in the midst of chaos, in the midst of a world that isn't yet what it should be. We can look to sometimes the small things to find God's commitment to life, the cyclical things, the parts of our lives and our world that keep on going and keep on living. Because the truth is, even out of the things that kill and smother life, God somehow finds a way to bring about life. Despite all of this, despite 2020, despite of whatever life has to hold for us and for our neighbor, nature is still growing. It's a sign that shows us that God is still at work and that God has not abandoned us. In just a few weeks, we will celebrate Christmas, marking God's wild idea to become human and dwell with us and among us in all of this. And Jesus, God makes a commitment to be with us in all of this because God has now been in all of this too. God doesn't shy away from what this world brings. Jesus is born, lives, develops relationships, has friends, has family, mourns the death of friends, walks with people who are hungry and hurting. Jesus walks through the joys and the sorrows that this human life can bring. Then seemingly counter to this commitment to life, Jesus walks the road to the cross, and he dies the death of a political dissident. Then God surprises us again. Jesus is raised from the dead, so not even death stands in the way of God's commitment to life, to restoration, to wholeness. And in our baptisms, we are drawn into that commitment to life. We are promised life, life eternal, despite the ways that the world, as it is, tries to stifle it. And with that, we rejoice, and with that, we give thanks.